Good evening, everyone. Oh, let's not be so formal. Good evening, everyone. That's better. My name's David Gray. I'm the host of the Calgary Eye Opener on CBC Radio 1. If you don't believe me, I'm wearing CBC socks, just to snazzy, I know. If you listen to the show, I promise you it's a little weird for me to see what you look like too. So. Very nice to be here. I'm also a graduate of this university. It was a long time ago, I think 1987. Yes, represent. Very good. History and political science was my undergraduate degree. The place looked a lot different then. This building wasn't here, that's for sure. There were a lot more flock of seagulls haircuts. Maybe some of you remember rugby pants. That was what it was like back then. And this lecture wasn't here. There wasn't a lecture of a lifetime back in those days. Some of those lectures I seem to remember lasting a lifetime. Of course, I was 19 then. I'm sure it was my fault, not yours. Honestly, it's impressive how much this campus has grown, and it's so wonderful to see so many people here for an occasion like this. So I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the Blackfoot and the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, including Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nation. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. I like saying those words, probably because in some small part of what's been going on over the weekend, people may have been following the news, discussions about cultural appropriation, what's right and what's wrong. Have you noticed that people use that introduction in Calgary now at the beginning of a lot of meetings? It wasn't long ago we didn't say that. I received an email not long ago. I just want to mention this quickly. I received an email a while ago, and it was somebody who was upset that we say that at the beginning of things in Calgary now. They said it slows things down, and they don't like it. So I did what journalists do. I talked to an expert. Expert opinions still matter on this side of the border. They told me not to get in trouble. So in this case, I called up Chief Robert Joseph. Some of you may know Chief Robert Joseph. He's a hereditary chief from an isolated community in BC. He's also an ambassador for reconciliation in Canada, part of the Residential School Survivors Society. And I asked him, does it make a difference, this greeting that we do in Calgary? They do it all over Canada now. And he said, absolutely. And I wrote down his full answer because I wanted to share it. He said, don't be confused, he said. It's not about property ownership. It's about acknowledging the long millennial presence of Aboriginal people on this continent, and it's important because it allows us to examine our current history together. And we need to understand the pre-contact history and the current shared history we have before we can truly begin to move forward with a deeper understanding between all of us. It's small, it doesn't cost $1 million, but it's very, very important. So there you have it. That's why we say that in Calgary now. And now back to this evening's program. We have many special guests joining us this evening who I'd very much like to acknowledge. Chancellor Robert Thirsk is here, President and Vice Chancellor Elizabeth Cannon, members of our University of Calgary Board of Governors, members of the University of Calgary Senate, member of the University of Calgary Senior Leadership Team, Chancellor Emerita Joanne Cuthbertson, former Board of Governors, the former Board of Governor Chair Bonnie DuPont is here as well, former UCalgary President Terry White, University of Alberta Chancellor Doug Stollery, he's here. Right next to him is the University of Lethbridge Chancellor Janice Vazzari. And a special welcome to members of the Wyse family. Why don't you guys wave? I want to embarrass you in perfect. It's nice to have you here. Thank you all for joining us tonight for the University of Calgary's 10th Annual Lecture of a Lifetime series, tonight presented by Dr. George Wyse. Now, they took down the name of your lecture, but I really love it because I ask myself that question constantly. What am I doing here? I look forward to what you have to say. The Lecture of a Lifetime series was introduced by the University's Senate 10 years ago now to showcase the talents and achievements of leading University of Calgary academics and to celebrate the outstanding service to the university, its students, and the greater community. Lecture of a Lifetime was originally inspired by Dr. Randy Pausch's widely publicized last lecture at Carnegie Mellon in 2007. How many people watched that on YouTube or elsewhere? Or maybe the shorter version on Oprah, let's be honest. one or the other. It was very moving. Tonight, we are fortunate enough to hear from world-renowned cardiac arrhythmia clinician scientist Dr. George Wyse. George, down in front here. And before we welcome George to the stage, we have some people who would like to say a few words. It's with great pleasure I invite Dr. Elizabeth Cannon, the President and Vice Chancellor of the University of Calgary, to the stage. President Cannon.
Thank you so much, David. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the University of Calgary this evening for a very special event on our annual calendar. And that, of course, is a lecture of a lifetime featuring our very own Professor Emeritus, Dr. George Wyse. Thank you, David, for not only hosting CBC Calgary's Eye Opener, but for being here to be our host and a distinguished alumnus of the University of Calgary. I would also like to thank our Senate, because it's really through their leadership and their vision that tonight happens. They put so much hard work into ensuring that this is truly a community event and one that acknowledges leaders of our institution through their lectures. Each year, they put a lot of careful thought into selecting somebody who really embodies the vision of this university, who demonstrates extraordinary commitment to making an impact through innovation and discovery. And they have done an exceptional job this year, as always. I would also like to welcome all of our special guests here this evening, our students, faculty, alumni, our family members who are here, and friends, board members, Senate members, senior leadership team, as well as so many community supporters. And I want to particularly single out Alvin Libben and his partner Linda for being here, and of course the benefactor for the Libben Institute. Thank you, Alvin and Linda, for being here. One of the central themes of tonight's presentation is going to be about living life with a purpose, of connecting where you've been with where you want to go with a clear vision and how you can apply your skills to make a difference. Now, the University of Calgary has recently gone through an exercise like this as well. Many of you know we just concluded our 50th anniversary celebrations. And not only was this an opportunity to thank everyone who helped make this institution what it is in 50 short years, it was also an opportunity to look forward, to shape our next 50 years. We came together as a university and as a university community to really talk about what's important for us, to shape our vision. And through that, we launched the Energized Eyes High strategy as a legacy of our 50th. And in that strategy, we commit to being a global intellectual hub in Canada's most enterprising city. We commit to our goal of being a top 5 research university, one that is committed to student learning enriched with research, hands-on learning experiences, and entrepreneurial thinking, and doing this by fully integrating with our community. Well, if you put that all together, I can't think of a better speaker than Dr. George Wyse, who really pulls all this together through the work that he has done in his teaching, in his research, and to the community. So, George, on behalf of the University of Calgary and all of your friends and colleagues, thank you not only for being here this evening, but everything you've done to help make this university great. We really appreciate it and look forward to your presentation, and I'll pass it back to David to introduce our next speaker. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
A quick note, there's a chance some of you on Twitter, you might even be on it right now. If you are, please use the hashtags this evening at #UCalgary. Look at all these blank stares. #UCalgary. Or #2017-2017 LOAL. Make sure you put the A in there. #2017 LOAL. Good. At this time, I'd like to invite Dr. John Meddings, Dean of the Cummings School of Medicine, to introduce our Lecture of a Lifetime speaker. Doctor?
So, George, I hope you're worried. It's not often that a gastroenterologist gets to introduce a cardiologist. And I am delighted. So, ladies and gentlemen, I truly am delighted to be here. I want to tell you that the medical school just celebrated its 50th birthday. And tonight's speaker, George Wyse, is someone who has dedicated over 40 years of his career to the Cummings School of Medicine. And I have to tell you, is much admired and much loved over in the school. George has been someone who has been with us from the very beginning. George is one of the first Heart and Stroke Foundation medical scientists from 1971 to 1974 in this province. And this was an honor he assumed, actually, while he went and completed his medical degree at the Cummings School of Medicine. Following graduation, he began his faculty career as an assistant professor in 1978. And man, what a career he has had. George was Calgary's very first electrophysiology specialist, and he's become known for his expertise in arrhythmias. Cardiac electrophysiologists are the cardiologists who study the beat of the heart, the rhythm of the heart, the beat of life, if you want. He's had a massive number of publications, but what's most impressive isn't the number of publications that George has had, it's the impact that those publications have had around the world. George has changed medical care for people worldwide. George is now an emeritus professor, and in fact, he just retired from clinical work a few short months ago in January of this year. But his influence and his reach has been truly enormous. He's mentored many of our most valuable leaders, including Derek Exner, Todd Anderson. Todd is here with his wife, Karen. Todd is the leader of our Department of Cardiac Sciences and the Libin Cardiovascular Institute and is truly one of our most valued leaders. And outside of cardiology, the reach of George Wyse has been tremendous. Many of us, members of our current leadership team, myself included, would point to George as of having had a major impact on our careers. So I understand that George believes that the purpose and meaning of life has now been made clear to him. And for those of you who don't know the purpose and meaning of life, according to George, it is to play golf. George has left an incredible mark on the Cummings School of Medicine. In fact, his grubby little fingerprints are all over our place. We, the School of Medicine, the University of Calgary, owe an enormous debt of gratitude to George, and I am really, really looking forward to this talk. George.
Thanks, John. That was lovely. Chancellor Thirsk, President Cannon, Dean Meddings, ladies and gentlemen, I am certainly honored and humbled to be chosen to be this year's Lecturer of a Lifetime. At the same time, I'm a little apprehensive. I don't normally lecture to an audience of this type. And I'm not as good an entertainer as David Gray, but I do have a pair of socks on that has a golf bag on it. So before I start, I probably should explain the title of this lecture. When I first learned that I was going to be giving this lecture, I wondered what it would feel like to be up here at this particular time. And the first thing that popped into my head is, what am I doing here? So I decided to call this lecture, What Am I Doing Here? But I want to talk about not only that, but how did I get here and where are we going? Now, I've divided, that leads me, sorry, I forgot about this. I am a professor, and one of the roles of a professor is to give out reading assignments during the lecture. So you'll be delighted to hear there are reading assignments. This is your first reading assignment, and it addresses the question of how did we get here? It's a very readable book. It outlines a 70,000-year history of our species, and I think that you'll find that it stimulates your imagination. With respect to the question of where are we going, I'm going to begin with this well-known quotation. Prediction is very hard, particularly if it's about the future. Now, you'd probably be surprised to learn that it was Niels Bohr that said that. Niels Bohr won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1922. I don't think he was actually talking about predicting the future. What I think he was talking about was uncertainty in knowing all the properties of a quantum particle at the same moment in time, the so-called Heisenberg uncertainty principle. Now, I've divided this lecture up into 4 parts. The first part I called My Story. The second part and the third part are about 2 of the main functions of a university, research and teaching, and I called the second part Creating New Knowledge, and the third part Sharing Knowledge and Wisdom, and the final part will be a brief look at the future. So I'm going to start with my story, and in order to do that, I have to put on my storytelling hat. Now, my friend and colleague Brent Mitchell is very good at public lectures, and he always wears a hat. He's in the audience somewhere. The only person with a hat on besides me at this moment is Brent Mitchell. So I thought that wearing this hat might actually help with my story. And any story teller will tell you that one of the most difficult things about telling stories is deciding where to begin. And so I decided when I was thinking about this that this is the 150th anniversary of Canadian Confederation. We are a country of immigrants. And I thought I'd pick up the Sapien story somewhere near the end and give you a very brief version of my family tree, starting with these 2 individuals, who are the first 2 individuals on each side of my family who immigrated to what was to become Canada. And these 2 individuals are the first 2 individuals on each side of my family that were born in what was to become Canada. And I've skipped all the intervening generations down to my parents and me, and the 3 of us were born in Kamloops, BC, along with all my 7 siblings who are here tonight because I didn't think there'd be a big crowd. And that leads me to your next reading assignment, which follows on the theme of family, a topic about which everybody should know something at this particular time. Again, a very readable book that I think will stimulate your imagination. This is a picture of my father and me shortly after I was born. My father worked all his life for the Hudson's Bay Company. This picture was taken just before he went overseas in the Second World War. This is a picture of my mother, my older sister, and me, taken a few months later. And of course, a picture of this type was intended to be a memento for our fighting man overseas. I learned later, however, that it was a memento for our man overseas playing baseball. My father was a very good baseball player. There was a strong rivalry between the baseball teams of the Canadian and American armies. And the family legend is that my father was kept out of harm's way in England during the hostilities in order that he could play baseball. This is my older sister and me a few years later. I don't really remember much except for brief glimpses of memories in my preschool and early school years, but I think it was a happy time. It was probably not until I got to middle school that I started thinking about what I wanted to be when I grew up. And the first thing I thought I wanted to be was a bus driver. And I had no idea why I thought I wanted to be a bus driver. But what I noticed was that most bus drivers were overweight, and I didn't want to be overweight. And after all, Chancellor Thirsk, astronaut hadn't been invented yet. So bus driver came off the list pretty quick. In junior high school, I thought, well, maybe I could have a career playing hockey in the National Hockey League. Here's a picture of me with one of my hockey teams when I was about 15 or 16 years old. But again, I noticed that most of the young men from around Kamloops who had similar ambitions were back in Kamloops. They were unsuccessful. They were hanging out at the pool hall. They had no job, no education, and not much future. And the very few that were successful were back when less than 30 years old. And I thought, I don't want to have a career that's over when I'm 30 years old. And I didn't really like those odds. And finally, I would have had to leave home and billet with strangers in Regina. Because that's where the junior A team was that I had signed up, or the NHL team's junior A team that I had signed up with. So playing in the NHL also came off the list. In high school, I started to think maybe I could be a Catholic priest. As many of you know, a long-standing tradition in large French-Canadian families is that the oldest male child goes into the priesthood. However, when I looked into this a little further, I found out you had to do what you're told, and you had to believe stuff on the basis of faith, and I had a little bit of trouble with those things, but I had a lot of trouble with the celibacy thing. So being a Catholic priest also came off the list. It's probably in my final year of medical school that I first started thinking, final year of high school, I first started thinking about, well, maybe I could go to medical school. My mother had suffered greatly from severe high blood pressure at a time when there were no effective therapies, and the therapies that were available had a lot of adverse effects, and I thought maybe as a physician I could do something useful with my life. So I went to see the high school counselor, and the high school counselor said to me, only really smart people get into medical school. So what I was thinking is, she's telling me I'm not smart enough. So at that time, medical school came off the list, and I started thinking about what would be the next best thing if I couldn't go to medical school, and that's when I first thought about going to pharmacy school. So after finishing high school, I enrolled in pharmacy at the University of British Columbia, but after about 3 years, I was bored absolutely silly. One of the faculty there, pharmacologist Jack Halliday, suggested I do a research project for my final year thesis. So he became my first mentor. I did a research project with him in his lab, and that was the basis of my final year thesis. And lo and behold, that research project won a prize, a national prize. So I did finish pharmacy school. I graduated in 1974, a big year for us. Bonnie and I got married. We went off on a honeymoon, and we took a side trip to Halifax, where I picked up the prize for my research project and thesis. So then we started thinking, well, now what do we do? Well, this early success in research started me thinking about, well, maybe I could do something useful with a career in medical research. So the obvious choice was to go to graduate school. So I worked as a pharmacist over the summer months, and then in the fall I enrolled in graduate school, and I moonlighted as a pharmacist at nights and on weekends, and Bonnie worked as a teacher until I completed my MSc. And during that time, I heard of something that I'd never heard of before called an MRC studentship. This was a marvelous thing. If you applied for one of these things and you got one, the Medical Research Council actually paid you a stipend while you went to school. And it was $3,600 a year, tax-free, mind you. So I applied for one of these, and I got one of these, and so Bonnie and I packed up, and off we went, where I enrolled in a PhD program at the University of Manitoba and met my next mentor, Dr. Mark Nickerson. Shortly after we arrived in Winnipeg, Dr. Nickerson took a job as head of pharmacology and therapeutics at the medical school at McGill University. So Bonnie and I packed up, and off we went to Montreal, to McGill University, where I completed my PhD in 1969. And this is a picture of me with one of my research assistants in our lab at McGill in 1969. So graduate school was done. Once again, now what the heck do we do? I did briefly think about medical school at that time, but I was kind of burnt out and thought I needed a gap year or two, and so the obvious thing was to become a postdoctoral fellow. And I heard about something then called a postdoctoral fellowship, which is similar to the studentship I described earlier. If you have one of these, you're paid a stipend again while you hone your research skills under a mentor. And Dr. Nickerson had arranged for me to do such a fellowship with one of his colleagues at the University of Michigan at the time, Dr. Lloyd Beck. But by the time we got all the paperwork in order for us to enter the United States, Dr. Beck had taken the job as head of pharmacology at the medical school at the University of New Mexico. So Bonnie, Naomi, and I packed up, and off we went to Albuquerque, New Mexico. And Lloyd Beck became my next mentor, and there I further honed my skills in research in the area of vascular biology, and I will not be talking about any of that kind of research tonight. But after about 18 months, I actually got promoted to an assistant professor at the University of New Mexico. So graduate school was done, and the postdoctoral fellowship was done. This is a picture of Naomi and I in 1969 in Albuquerque Old Town. But at that time, as you all know, the Vietnam War was going on, and there had been a number of violent clashes between university students and the National Guard on several university campuses across the United States, including the University of New Mexico. So when we started thinking again about what are we going to do now, the obvious thing was to return to Canada. Once again, medical school was on my mind, but I didn't know how I'd be able to support our family. Our son David was on the way at that time. So the obvious thing was to get a faculty job. And I still wondered whether it might be possible to go to medical school while I continued to do research. Meanwhile, back in Calgary, as you've already heard, there were a number of things happening. In 1966, as we just heard, the University of Calgary became an independent university, and we've just finished celebrating our 50-year anniversary. The medical school was actually established in 1967, and we're in the process of celebrating our 50-year anniversary of our medical school right now. And Bill Cochran, the founding dean, arrived in Calgary in January of 1967. Bill later went on to become the president of the University of Calgary. And the first class of 32 students entered what was to become the Cummings School of Medicine in the fall of 1970. And that same year, I was on a road trip across Canada, interviewing at 4 different Canadian medical schools, including Calgary. The pretext of that visit was that I was looking for a job on the faculty. But I always slipped into the conversation, oh, by the way, I've always been kind of interested in medical school. Can you think of some way that I might be able to go to medical school and continue to do research? And here's where I reconnected with Keith McCannell. I knew Keith superficially because both of us had spent time at the University of Manitoba, and he was the founding head of pharmacology and therapeutics and the associate dean for research here at the University of Calgary Medical School. And this is what the Health Sciences Center looked like in the spring of 1970 at the time of my visit. Keith was the one that first informed me of this award called the Heart and Stroke Foundation of Canada Medical Scientist Award. This award doesn't exist anymore. They had just announced it. And the idea of this award was the Heart and Stroke Foundation wanted to increase the number of cardiovascular clinician scientists in the country. And they were going to make the first 2 awards in the country in 1971. And if you had a PhD and you were accepted into a medical school, the Heart and Stroke Foundation would pay you a stipend while you went to medical school. So again, I was getting paid to go to medical school. So I applied for one of these while I was still in New Mexico, and I applied to 3 of the 4 medical schools I visited. And I got one of these awards, and we ended up coming here to the University of Calgary, partly because it was the first medical school that accepted me into the class in the fall of 1971. But partly because of what I've always referred to as a Calgary kind of can-do attitude. We'll kind of figure out a way to do this sort of thing that I hadn't encountered in a lot of other places. And the way this worked is that Keith McCannell became my avatar and my mentor. As a student, I wasn't allowed to hold an operating grant. But while I was still in New Mexico, I made an application for peer review to the Heart and Stroke Foundation of Alberta for an operating grant. And what we did was we sent this application in with Keith McCannell listed as the principal investigator and me as a co-investigator. And after peer review, that grant application was actually funded. So this allowed me money to set up my research in a corner of Keith McCannell's lab while I was going to medical school. And the other thing that helped was in the curriculum of the Cummings School of Medicine, there's a lot of unstructured self-learning time. And this allowed me time that I could spend in the lab with my research assistants, so I continued to do research. This is my New Mexico look, until I graduated from medical school in 1974. And this was really the beginning of a lifelong association between me and the University of Calgary and the Heart and Stroke Foundations of Alberta and Canada. There were still a couple of things on my training to-do list. I had to do an internal medicine residency, which I did at the Foothills Medical Center. At that time, I was no longer considered to be a student, so I could apply for and hold my own grants, and I had an appointment as a part-time assistant professor while I was a resident. And I had to do a cardiology residency, and again, the Heart and Stroke Foundation of Alberta stepped up, and they provided me with a fellowship while I was off in Oregon doing my training in cardiology. And there in 1976, I first heard of something called clinical cardiac electrophysiology and met my next mentor, Dr. Sabu Ramtula. So finally in 1978, my formal training was finished. So of course, the family went to Disneyland. But the Calgary saga continued. I returned to Calgary in 1978. I felt an obligation to do there. First of all, the University of Calgary had allowed me to achieve a lifelong goal of becoming a physician, and the Heart and Stroke Foundation had supported me during all of these years. So I felt that I needed to come here and try to make a contribution here in Alberta. Heart and Stroke Foundation continued to support me with something called the clinical investigatorship, which contributed money to my salary and freed up time from my clinical duties in order that I could do research. Shortly after I arrived, I actually started thinking about leaving again for a variety of reasons I'm not going to go into. But there were three things that happened in quick succession that convinced me to stay. The first was that in 1980, Eldon Smith arrived as the first head of an academic division of cardiology in the Cummings School of Medicine, and he became my next mentor. The second was that the Alberta Heritage Foundation for Medical Research was established in 1980, and they supported me during a good chunk of my career as well with a scholarship which allowed me protected time to do research as well. But more importantly, they allowed for dramatic growth of the research capacity of the Cummings School of Medicine in the 1980s and early 1990s. And as part of that, Hank Duff and Brent Mitchell arrived in 1982, and together the three of us became the founding members of the Clinical Cardiac Arrhythmia Group in the Cummings School of Medicine. And here we are, all dressed up on the occasion of a visit to the Foothills Medical Center by Premier Peter Lougheed. So that's the end of what I've called my story, and I'm going to switch gears a little bit. That's why I took my story hat off, and get a little more serious. And I've subtitled this section, Trials and Fibrillations, for reasons that will become clear in a minute. But I stole that title from Dr. John Mandrola's blog. Now, this slide shows what's known as the hierarchy of levels of evidence for clinical application. And the emerging idea in medicine at that time in the late 70s and early 1980s, something that would later be called evidence-based medicine, was that insofar as possible, the practice of medicine should be based on the highest quality of evidence, level 1 evidence, randomized controlled trials. And so far, most of the research that I've been doing on patients was no higher than level 2. And where I really wanted to be was producing level 1 evidence doing randomized controlled trials. So over 40 years, I've been involved in a number of randomized controlled trials. This slide just shows the acronyms of some of the trials that I've been involved with. And if you're interested in being involved in multi-center randomized controlled trials, this is your reading assignment. Now, all these randomized controlled trials made a difference. A few of them made a big difference, and I want to tell you briefly about two of those. The first one was called CAST, and that acronym stands for Cardiac Arrhythmia Suppression Trial, and it was all about using antiarrhythmic drugs to suppress ventricular premature beats after a recent myocardial infarction with the intent of reducing the risk of death. And the second one was called AFFIRM, and that acronym stands for Atrial Fibrillation Follow-up Investigation of Rhythm Management. And it was all about using mostly drugs, but also other treatments to try to keep people with atrial fibrillation in normal rhythm as much as possible. And the purpose of that was to try to reduce the risk of stroke and death in these patients. Now, the reason that I've chose these two to talk about is that, first of all, I had a major leadership role in both of these trials. And secondly, or more importantly, because these two trials are what we call reversals. 9 out of 10 randomized controlled trials support or expand the use of a treatment in a particular medical condition. Only 1 out of 10 randomized controlled trials is a reversal, and they're called reversals because the results of these trials stop physicians from doing something they're already doing, either because it doesn't work and or because it's harmful. Now, before I talk about these two trials, I have to give you a brief tutorial in basic cardiac electrophysiology. This is your heart and the normal ECG, and near the top of your heart there is a cluster of specialized cells called the sinus node or pacemaker that has the unique property of being able to automatically generate electrical impulses. And it's those electrical impulses as they move through the heart that make the muscle in the walls of the heart twitch or contract. And therefore, the first part of the normal heartbeat is the upper two chambers of the heart, the atria, and they're called atria because they're primarily holding chambers. They're not a major part of the pumping system. And you can see the muscle in the walls of the atrium is thinner than the muscle in the walls of the two lower chambers, the main pumping part of the heart, called the ventricles. And muscle is a very good conductor of electricity, but between each ventricle and its atrium, there's a heart valve. And that heart valve and the apparatus holding it in place is made out of cartilage, not muscle. And cartilage, unlike muscle, is not a very good conductor of electricity, so there has to be some way for the electrical impulse from the sinus node pacemaker at the top to expeditiously get to the bottom of the heart to tell the ventricle to contract, and that's done by the specialized cardiac conduction system shown here in yellow. And the first part of that is the AV node, which is located at the junction between the atria and the ventricle, penetrates through the cartilage and electrically connects the atria to the ventricles. And this is what your heart and the ECG look like when you're in normal or sinus rhythm. So what you see here is the sinus node fires. That yellow wave is the electricity moving through the heart muscle. And as you see, it makes the heart muscle contract in an orderly fashion. First, the atria, after a short pause, the ventricle. And that's what the ECG looks like. Now, in this system, there are things that can go wrong, sometimes seriously wrong. And CAST was all about the problem of sudden death. This is the definition of sudden death. It's a sudden absence of pulse, breathing, and consciousness. It occurs suddenly and unexpectedly within no longer than 1 hour after any change in the usual state of health or change in symptoms. It's not related to trauma, and it includes people who die quietly in their sleep. And there are a number of potential causes for sudden death. A lung or a brain catastrophe is a potential cause, but that's relatively rare. Sudden circulatory failure due to massive internal bleed or a clot in a critical place that can cause sudden cardiac death, but again, quite rare. By far, the commonest cause of sudden death is sudden cardiac death, which is due to a sudden circulatory failure due to either the absence of any heartbeats or the development of an abnormal rhythm called ventricular fibrillation, or VF. And this is what your heart looks like when you're in ventricular fibrillation, and this is what the ECG looks like. In the ventricle, there is continuous chaotic electrical activity. The ventricle is no longer contracting, it just sits there and quivers. And when this happens, a person loses consciousness within 5 to 8 seconds. If it's not reversed within 5 minutes, the chances of survival drop dramatically. If it's not reversed within 10 to 12 minutes, death is almost invariable. And this slide outlines the background hypothesis for the CAST trial. We already knew that half of the deaths after a recent myocardial infarction were sudden cardiac deaths. We knew that if you measured the ventricular premature beats in a person with recent myocardial infarction with a 24-hour ECG recording and the ventricular premature beats were increased in frequency, that was associated with an increase in sudden cardiac death. And I already told you that 75% of sudden cardiac deaths are due to ventricular fibrillation. And this led to the idea that ventricular premature beats are a trigger for sudden cardiac death and VF, something called the VPB suppression hypothesis shown on the right of this slide. In the center, you see a direct line from a recent myocardial infarction through increased frequency of ventricular premature beats to an increased risk of death, sudden cardiac death from ventricular fibrillation. And part of the reason for that thinking is based on the ECG recording shown on the far right of this slide. This is an ambulatory ECG recording that was taken from a person who actually had a sudden cardiac death. And what you see is about halfway through the recording, this person develops ventricular fibrillation. But just prior to the ventricular fibrillation, there is a flurry of ventricular premature beats. And this led to the idea that if you could reduce the ventricular premature beats, you could reduce the risk of sudden cardiac death. Now, at that time, in the mid-1980s, there were several new drugs that had just been approved that were remarkably effective at suppressing ventricular premature beats. And a survey at that time also said that more than half of cardiologists were already using these drugs to treat ventricular premature beats. So the VPB suppression hypothesis became the basis for the statistical analysis plan of the CAST trial. Now, before I show you the results of the CAST trial, I have to tell you what I call my cats and dogs story. This is a map of the centers that were involved in CAST. 3 in Canada, including Calgary, 1 in Sweden, most in the United States. And this study was sponsored by the National Institutes of Health, or NIH, which is the major US government agency that funds this kind of research. And they had just done a study that they called BHAT, in which they showed that if you gave beta blockers to people that had a recent myocardial infarction, you reduce the risk of subsequent death. And they wanted to do a similar study in which they gave antiarrhythmic drugs to patients who had a recent myocardial infarction. They wanted to call that study for CATS, for Cardiac Arrhythmia Treatment Study. So the way they operated at that time is, when they were interested in doing a study like this, they would send out a brief one-page description of what they were thinking of, what they wanted to do. And if you were interested in being part of the study, you applied by sending in a description of how you would design the study if you were in charge, and what the resources were like at your institution that would allow you to become a successful enrolling center. So Dr. Smith had brought this to our attention, and Hank Duff and Brent Mitchell and I sat down, and we thought we'd submit an application. And this is what we submitted. We thought that you should take consenting patients who had a recent myocardial infarction, measure their ventricular premature beats, and if they had frequent ventricular premature beats, they would enter an open label phase in which everybody was treated with antiarrhythmic drugs. Everybody knew they were being treated with antiarrhythmic drugs, and then we would remeasure their ventricular premature beats, and if their ventricular premature beats were not suppressed, we called that part of the study DOGS, for did not observe good suppression. And those patients didn't go into the randomized part of the study, they just went into a registry, and no specific therapy was prescribed for their ventricular premature beats. On the other hand, those patients whose ventricular premature beats were suppressed entered the randomized part of the study, which we called CATS, and they were divided into 2 groups randomly, and half of them took the antiarrhythmic drug that suppressed their ventricular premature beats, and the other half took a matching placebo in a double-blind fashion. So we showed this to Dr. Smith before we sent it in. And he said, "Good job, boys. Send that in, but you can't call it cats and dogs. They just won't take you seriously. You'll never get to be an enrolling center." So we sent it in anyway, and we just called it CATS. And this actually became the protocol for CAST, and the reason the name was changed. And partly because of this reason, I became one of 3 physicians on the executive of the planning and steering committees for the CAST trial. This is the main result of the CAST trial. And because of this startling and unexpected result, this trial was suddenly and prematurely terminated at the recommendation of the Data and Safety Monitoring Board. And what this slide shows you, the vertical axis is a percent survival from death or cardiac arrest. The horizontal axis is time in days. The time it was prematurely terminated, 1,455 patients had been randomized. And what you see here is, in the upper darker line, the survival was better in the patients taking placebo than it was in the lower lighter line in the patients that were taking antiarrhythmic drugs. So not only did CAST show that the VPB suppression hypothesis is not true, but these drugs can actually kill people when they're given after a recent myocardial infarction. And until this day, physicians still avoid certain antiarrhythmic drugs in patients that had a recent myocardial infarction. And CAST is often cited as the reason why we need to continue to do these randomized controlled trials. Now, this result was so startling that the NIH immediately called together a 2-day workshop in Bethesda, just outside of Washington, D.C., in which they invited what they considered to be the thought leaders in arrhythmia management from across the country. And several of us were invited to give lectures during the 2-day period, but most of the time was set aside for a discussion about, given this result, what should be the next thing we should do in treatment of arrhythmia. And the result of that was a trial called AVID, which I'm not going to talk about. That acronym stands for Antiarrhythmics versus Implantable Defibrillators. And in that study, if a consenting person had survived, been resuscitated from a VF cardiac arrest, they were randomized to be treated with antiarrhythmic drugs, which was the usual care at that time, or one of these new implantable cardioverter defibrillators, or ICDs, that were just becoming available in suitable numbers in the late 80s and early 1990s. And the bottom line here is that ICDs and bioengineering have taken over the treatment for prevention of sudden cardiac death in these patients. During that 2 days, there was one speaker, Ed Pritchett from the Duke University, who gave a lecture advocating that the next thing in arrhythmia treatment should be something about treatment of arrhythmia in patients with atrial fibrillation. And when I got back to Calgary and we were enrolling patients in these ICD trials, it was clear that we were seeing a lot more patients with atrial fibrillation than we ever saw who were resuscitated from a VF cardiac arrest. And that was the beginning of the ideas behind the AFFIRM trial. I had a sabbatical coming, so I went off to Bethesda for 6 months, where we began designing, planning, and asking for funding for the AFFIRM trial. During that time, I actually got to go to the first Clinton inauguration. But when I got back to Calgary, I went back and forth several times between Bethesda and Calgary while we continued to design and plan the study. I became the chairman of the executive of both the planning and the steering committees of this trial. The trial finally began enrolling patients in 1995. AFFIRM was all about atrial fibrillation. This is the definition of atrial fibrillation. It's basically the same as ventricular fibrillation, only the fibrillation is confined to the atrium. The bottom chambers, the ventricles, the main pumping part of the heart, continue to receive electrical impulses through the conduction system, but usually at a faster and more irregular rate. And this is what your heart and the ECG looks like when you're in atrial fibrillation. Again, you see this continuous chaotic electrical activity in the atria. The atrium is not contracting, it just kind of sits there and quivers. And the ventricle continues to beat, although, as I said, irregularly and often more rapid than usual. And this is what the ECG looks like when you're in atrial fibrillation. Now, there's no risk of imminent death in atrial fibrillation, but even if there's no risk of imminent death, there are some consequences. First of all, there's some loss of efficiency of the heart as a pump, but not very much, and for most people it doesn't really amount to anything. As I told you already, the heart beats more irregular and often faster, and in some people this causes symptoms. Not everybody has symptoms. About 20% of people that have atrial fibrillation don't have any symptoms. And even the patients that have symptoms, many of them also have episodes that are asymptomatic. But about 25% do have debilitating symptoms. Furthermore, there were some known associations compared to those without atrial fibrillation. Those with atrial fibrillation have an increased risk of subsequent stroke. And we knew from ultrasound studies and from postmortem studies that stasis of blood in the left atrium, particularly the left atrial appendage, results in clot formation. And if a piece of clot migrates from the left atrium to the brain, it can block an artery and cause permanent brain damage, which is what a stroke is. Furthermore, we knew that compared to those without atrial fibrillation, those with atrial fibrillation had an increased risk of subsequent death. So this slide is the background hypothesis and rationale for the AFFIRM trial. Most physicians believe that clots from the left atrium cause most, if not all, strokes in atrial fibrillation patients. And it had recently been shown that warfarin, an anticoagulant, remarkably reduces the risk of stroke in these patients. Most physicians believe that atrial fibrillation itself directly contributes to subsequent death in these patients. And therefore, most physicians believe that keeping people in normal rhythm, keeping these people in normal rhythm, prevents strokes. And some of them believe if you could do that, you could stop the warfarin. And it also reduces mortality, something called the AF suppression conversion hypothesis shown here on the right. However, there was a competing smaller group of people that I was in that put forward what was known as the skeptics hypothesis, and they felt that keeping people in normal rhythm might have no effect on stroke or death in these patients. And there were a couple of reasons for that. First of all, there's a large number of comorbidities that are associated with atrial fibrillation that also cause stroke and death. Things like age, high blood pressure, diabetes, heart failure, and ischemic heart disease. And the drugs that were used for keeping people in normal rhythm really didn't work all that well a lot of the time. And given our experience in CAST, we were concerned about the possibility that the drugs actually might be harmful. So the skeptics hypothesis actually became the basis for the statistical analysis of plan in the AFFIRM trial. And this is the design of the AFFIRM trial. It's much simpler than the design of the CAST trial. It's probably an early example of what we would now call a pragmatic randomized controlled trial. First of all, the treatment was not blinded. The treating physician could use any therapy they wanted as long as it was approved. And the outcomes were unambiguous and easily determined. The primary outcomes here were death and stroke. And we simply took patients, consenting patients, who were having recurrent atrial fibrillation, who had stroke risk factors and were taking anticoagulants, and we randomized them into one of two groups. In the first group, their physicians were instructed to try to keep this person in sinus rhythm as much as possible. And in the second group, their physicians were told to make no attempt to try to keep the person in sinus rhythm, to just use treatments that control the heart rate during the atrial fibrillation attacks, kept it from being too fast or too slow. And this is the result of the AFFIRM trial with respect to the outcome of all of mortality. In this case, the vertical axis is cumulative mortality, and the horizontal axis is time in years. This study was not prematurely terminated. 4,060 patients were randomized, and the last patient randomized was followed for 2 years before the study ended. And what you see here is that there was no statistically significant difference in the rate of death between these two treatment strategies in these patients. There was, however, this worrisome slight excess of mortality in the patients where the physicians were trying to keep them in normal rhythm. And this is the result of the AFFIRM trial with respect to the outcome of strokes. And you can see there's absolutely no difference in the risk of stroke between these two rhythm strategies. Now, during this study, about 75% of the patients who were being kept in normal rhythm continued to take their anticoagulation, but about 25% of them did not. And what we found was that 2/3 of the strokes occurred in that 25% that stopped taking their anticoagulants. So until this day, we continue anticoagulation in high-risk patients no matter what rhythm strategy is used. Subsequent analysis showed that it was more costly because of more hospitalizations to try to keep people in normal rhythm. But in that 25% who had debilitating symptoms, there was better relief of symptoms. So the bottom line with respect to AFFIRM was the skeptics were right. We were wrong in CAST, but we were right here. And the reasons to keep elderly patients with atrial fibrillation and stroke risk factors and already taking anticoagulants in normal or sinus rhythm using drugs are informed relief of symptoms or informed patient preference. And in this case, informs means there's a discussion with the patient that talks about net clinical benefit. What's the balance between risk and harm before they make a choice? And since AFFIRM, efforts to maintain sinus rhythm have been markedly reduced for these patients, and physicians are much more selective. Now, as a result of being involved in all these trials, I got to travel all over the world giving lectures. And this is a picture of Bonnie and I in one of our more pleasant locations. I was particularly popular in Japan for a short period of time. I was there on 5 separate occasions between 2003 and 2005. I don't know why it was so short-lived. We also got our picture taken with important people, in this case, President Cannon. In this case, the two very important people are Beverly and Sam Moselle. Beverly and Sam Moselle have been among the strongest philanthropic supporters of the Libman Institute since its founding in 2004, and they continue to be among our strongest philanthropic supporters. And this slide allows me to highlight the importance of philanthropic support from the community in allowing any university to achieve its desired level of excellence. And the community can do that either directly through the Eyes High campaign that President Cannon mentioned a few minutes ago, or indirectly by contributing to charitable organizations like the Heart and Stroke Foundation of Alberta that fund our research. So that's the end of the heavy going, when I talked about my research. Now I'm going to give you a brief sampler of my approach to teaching. And to do this, I'm going to go through one of my 12-step programs. Now, the cardiology trainees in the Cummings School of Medicine, the research trainees in Lebanon and elsewhere will tell you that often when I'm giving them lectures, I use the framework of a 12-step program. And you're probably asking yourself, why a 12-step program? There's no good reason for it, except that I notice it works very well for Alcoholics Anonymous and other organizations like that. So I have a number of 12-step programs, and I'm going to briefly go through one of them, which I call my 12-step program for a successful career in research. And the reason I chose this one is because I think these 12 steps probably apply to a successful career in many other things. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go briefly through the 12 steps and just highlight what I think are the more important steps. So here's the first step, an important one. Do the math. And here is the math. Success is equal to the product of hard work multiplied by a prepared open mind times ability raised to the power of 1 point y, where y is luck. And at this point, there's always a bright young math scholar in the audience that says, well, you know, why is this a product and not a sum? Well, the reason this is a product and not a sum is whenever hard work, open-mindedness, or ability approach zero, success is unlikely. Step 2, hard work is more important at the beginning. Step 3, learn to multitask. This is an important one. And for this, I use the metaphor of an old steam locomotive. And what you see in this steam locomotive is that it has many wheels of all different sizes. And I tell the trainees to think of these wheels as their research projects, and they need more than one research project going on at a time. And all these wheels work together in order to move this train or the career forward. And I tell them also to think of a revolution of the wheel as producing a peer-reviewed manuscript. The big wheels go around more slowly, but they produce the peer-reviewed manuscripts get published in high-impact peer-reviewed journals, and those are the ones that make your reputation. But the little wheels are also important. They go around faster, but they support the big wheels with funds, students, and infrastructure. And if you're interested in learning how to multitask, this is your reading assignment. Step 4, science is a team sport. Step 5, keep a research focus. Step 6 is an important one. Learn to embrace change. This is counterintuitive to most human beings. With few exceptions, contrary to what you've heard, science is never settled. You're in the business of making change. You're not in the business of preserving the status quo or dogma. You need to strive to be the first to know a new fact, never be the last. And remember, as we go forward, change is happening faster than it ever has before, so be ready. Step 8. I missed step 7. Step 8, imitate good role models, don't plagiarize. Step 9 is an important one. Plan bite-sized epochs of time. A career starting in 2017 will probably last until 2067 or longer. You cannot plan 40 to 50 years, and it's increasingly rare that one person will do one job for the rest of their life. You need to break it up into manageable chunks of, say, 3 to 5 years. You'll probably have at least 3 to 4 mini-careers before you're done. Learn and adapt. The mantra here is survival, to paraphrase Darwin, survival of the most adaptable, including some of you in this room. Some might cross over to the dark side. And remember that opportunities rarely happen when it's convenient. Your plan needs flexibility. Step 10 is an important one. Take some risks. This is a famous quotation from Albert Einstein. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting a different result. Doing the same experiment again and again can be a death spiral for a research career. Be prepared to be wrong and learn from your mistakes. And for those of you that have the opportunity, sabbatical is a time to make a change. Make sure you use it. Step 11, another important one. Good ideas come from interaction with others. Good research ideas start out as blobs, and they require shaping, tuning, and tweaking. So use all opportunities to discuss your work with others. And if nobody else has ever thought of it, it's probably not a good idea. And good research ideas seldom appear in dreams. There was a time when I thought they actually might. Important last step is you need to put aside time for thinking about your research. Particularly as a clinician scientist, you're torn in many directions. You have a family, you have patients, you have teaching and administrative responsibilities, but you need time when you're just thinking about your research. And this is where you can use multitasking. And I used exercise training and long plane trips to think about my research, particularly when I was training for marathons 100 years ago. Step 12, the last and most important step. Choose an understanding and supportive life partner. Make sure you discuss career plans and goals of both of you. Remember, these will change every 3 to 5 years, so you need to do it again and again. There will be bumps. A partnership is not all about you. Learn the art of compromise. And clearly in this step, I hit the jackpot. Now, I'm going to do something dangerous and finish with a brief look at the future. And this is going to be brief for a couple of reasons. First of all, because of that quotation of Niels Bohr I showed you at the beginning. But secondly, because I've titled this section Precision Medicine. And a wise mentor once told me, try not to talk about things you don't know anything about. But precision medicine is the emerging concept in medicine right now. I'm not sure I know what it's all about. I'm pretty sure that some of the people that are going around talking about it don't know what it's all about. And I'm going to approach it from the perspective of a trialist, because that's what I've been for the last 40 years. And before I talk about precision medicine, I want to show you what I call my nerdy trialist slide and remind you about two important facts about randomized controlled trials. The first is that whenever you're designing a randomized controlled trial, there is a competition between what we call internal validity and external validity, or generalizability. The more you work to improve one, the more the other one worsens. Internal validity is all about rigor in the protocol, complex outcome determination. It often has a narrow, small sample. And therefore, the results are narrowly applicable, but the treatment effect is often maximized. External validity, on the other hand, is about inclusivity, simpler protocols and outcome assessment, broader, larger samples, but the results you get here are more widely applicable, although the treatment effect is usually smaller. And the second important point about randomized controlled trials, like the ones I showed you earlier, whenever you get a result, the results are an average of your selected study sample. And precision medicine is about moving beyond the average, and what I've called in this slide, parsing the average. So if you start off with a disease population and you select from that disease population a subset of patients and do a randomized controlled trial, the results you get are an average of that study sample. But if you think about this for a minute, in this average, there is a person who had no benefit and had adverse effects. You want to identify that person because you don't want to offer this treatment to that person. There will be a person that had no benefit and no adverse effects, and you want to identify that person because that just increases the cost of healthcare if you treat them with this treatment. There will be a person who had benefit and adverse effects, and you want to be able to identify that person and have a discussion with them about net clinical benefit. What's the balance between risk and harm? And finally, there will be a person who had benefit and no adverse effects, and that's the ideal person for that treatment. You'd like to be able to identify that person. The problem we're faced with in medicine right now is, how do you do this when you're faced with an individual patient in the doctor's office? Well, if the patient fits the profile of the study sample, you can parse the average of the study sample and apply it to that particular patient. What do you do, however, with the patient that doesn't fit the study profile, never got into a trial, Can we do better than guessing? Is there a way to parse the average in the people that don't get into randomized controlled trials but have the medical condition? And the driving force behind precision medicine is what I've called the new toolbox, which I'm outlining on this slide. And what it starts with is traditional data we've always used in these kinds of studies: genomics, the results of molecular diagnostics, yes or no answers based on the imaging, yes or no answers based on the physical history and physical examination. And what we've added to this recently is previously unavailable, unstructured data, basically anything that can be digitized. So the narrative of the history and physical examination, the progress notes, the consultant's notes, the diagnostic images themselves, data from continuous wearable monitors and mobile device and social media follow-up, and many more things. And what brings these things together is the new guy, which is big data storage and big data analytics, or artificial intelligence. We are now storing data in these cases in geobytes. Geobytes are 10 to the 30 bytes. A megabyte is a measly 10 to the 6 bytes. And this is the vision for precision medicine, and I'm going to go through it in a stepwise fashion. It's an iterative process. That's why there's a circle here in the middle. And the idea is that you begin with all the patients that have the medical condition. You recruit as many as possible, all of them if you can, and you vacuum up all the available data that you can get on those patients. You ascribe that data to an individual patient. You curate and collate the data in these big databases that have just recently become available, and then you analyze that data with big data analytics and artificial intelligence, and you report your results, and then you repeat the process. And this slide outlines what the goals of precision medicine, and I've called this "Where does a trialist fit in?" because I'm kind of wondering about that. And these are the two goals. The first is facilitation of discovery science. What we want to do here is improve the toolbox. We want to know not only who to treat, but when to treat. And we want new therapies, and we want new therapy targets. We also, the second goal is we want to do more efficient clinical research, and this is where the trialist fits in. And you can imagine a number of innovative and new ways that we're going to do randomized controls that are different from the ways that we've done randomized controls and trials in the past. For example, with respect to new therapies, we're already seeing randomized controlled trials where only patients with a certain genome are studied. And these studies often show dramatic results, but they have narrow, limited applicability. So on the other hand, with respect to new therapies, we want to do pragmatic randomized controlled trials with simplified data collection and outcome determination. And we wanted these to be widely generalizable, so we take large samples of patients. And these studies will have a good generalizability, and they will also be a great source for artificial intelligence analytics to try to figure out how to deal with the patients that extrapolate from these trials to the patients that aren't entered into trials. And finally, a neglected area of research. This one is in the area of therapies that are already approved. Often, there's 12 different therapies for a particular medical condition. And we need to try to figure out which of these 12 therapies is better for this individual patient. Will this vision be fulfilled? I have no friggin' idea. There are a number of potential problems. The one I'm going to focus on to finish up here is what I've called human versus machine mismatch. And that leads me to your final reading assignment, which is Tom Friedman's latest book. And in this book, Friedman points out that the rate of technological change is accelerating. It has been accelerating for 30, 40 years. It's going to accelerate for the foreseeable future. Moore's law states that computing power doubles approximately every 2 years. Computers are already a huge part of medical practice, and going forward, they're going to be even bigger part of medical practice. Computers already know more than human medical practitioners. As an example, IBM's Watson could take over interpretation of 90% of the diagnostic imaging that we do. Can you imagine the pushback we would get if Alberta Health Services announced that tomorrow We're no longer going to pay doctors to do interpretations of diagnostic imaging. Watson's going to do it. And what that leads Friedman to pointing out is the evolution of human attitudes, beliefs, human design organizations, and governance is not accelerating. And that creates the human versus machine mismatch. And going forward, we're going to have to figure out a way how to deal with that. And it leads to this question. How do we provide aspects of medicine like empathy in the age of increased computers that we're facing in medicine? And a potential answer to this question, we need to teach our students to be adaptable, lifelong learners, less resistant to change, to coexist with and use technology while they provide the human aspects of care. So that's the end of my formal remarks, and I want to have a few thank yous. First of all, it should be obvious during my presentation that my family is important to me, and they have been very supportive of me during this journey, particularly my wife, Bonnie. I want to thank all of you for coming and listening to me rant for about an hour. I also want to point out that what am I doing here is not the fruits of one person. I would like to acknowledge all the mentors I've had over the years that I was unable to mention by name, and I want to also thank my other family, the Gang of Six, the original members of the Cardiac Arrhythmia group in the Cummings School of Medicine. The new guys in that group, some of them aren't that new anymore. Our other colleagues in the Division of Cardiology, interventionalists, imagers, intensivists, who have helped us look after our patients and do our research. The countless nurses, lab techs, research assistants, grad students, and fellows who have also helped us look after our patients and do our research. Our other colleagues in the Libban Institute and elsewhere in the University of Calgary who have helped us. And I want to specifically mention Joyce Forster. Those of you who have worked in the university will recognize that administrative assistants and executive assistants often come and go as if they're going through a revolving door. I have had one permanent assistant for as short as one day. Joyce Forster stuck it out with me for 15 years, and I often thought this Unger cartoon was specifically about Joyce and I. We often had these kind of esoteric conversations back and forth through the open door between my office and her nearby working station. Finally, I want to come back to this picture of my mother. I told her about her troubles with high blood pressure. What I didn't tell you was that she tragically and prematurely died when she was only 42 years old, and I was still a teenager. Her life and her death had a profound effect on me and my career choices. I often wondered what it would be like when I was preparing this lecture to be able to tell her what I did with my life. Of course, that's not possible. I want to remind you of this reading assignment about genes and close by saying, Naomi, David, Sophie, Sam, and Max, each of you has a bit of my mother in you, so this one is for you. Thank you. Thank you.
We're going to do a Q&A now. Is that okay, George?
Yeah, it was great. It was perfect. Yeah, thanks. Thank you. Thank you.
Good news. We're not letting them leave yet. There are microphones set up in the aisles on both sides. This is your opportunity to ask George a question or two. We're going to have a short question and answer period. So please feel free to make your way to the microphone if a question's top of mind. Do you want your story hat for this part, George? Or
No, I think
you're
I'll wait
straight
till I
up?
hear the question.
Okay,
and
great.
If it seems like a story question, I'll put my story hat on.
All right. All I ask is that you ask your question in the form of a question. That would be very helpful. So we'll start right here, sir.
Congratulations, George. That was wonderful. You know, when we look at the sphere of scientific knowledge, that volume has been increasing exponentially, and you talked about Friedman as well. And some would say that that's resulted in research in silos, and the outcome of that is solutions that don't really work in the real world all the time. James I can't remember his name, former MIT president, talked about the importance possibly of the humanities and the education of new scientists. And he used the term, we need bifocal vision. What are your thoughts about the importance of the liberal arts in the education of future scientists? And was there an element of that that inspired or informed your own work?
Thank you for that question. I think there is a lot of room for multidisciplinary, multi-sectoral research. I mean, I think going forward, when I began in science, the silos were even worse. We've done a lot of work over the last 40 years in trying to break down the silos. Mostly we've broken down silos within sciences, and not so much, sciences and engineering maybe, not so much in the arts and other areas, although economics has become a huge part of medicine. But we have to branch out and do that. I was starting to say when I was beginning, there was, particularly in the bench research, scientists often worked in their labs with their door closed and didn't talk to anybody. There was a huge paranoia about people stealing their ideas. And I think we've overcome a lot of that, as I said during the presentation. It's really important for people to interact in order to work. And I think we're seeing more and more interaction between some of the social sciences and the medical sciences in particular. Social sciences are very good at something called qualitative research. Most of us in hard science are used to quantitative research. And I think we have to try to bring those two things together because qualitative research is equally important. And I think will take us in new directions and maybe help solve some of the problems that I talked about the mismatch between machines and humans.
Good. Microphones are open. If anyone has a question, if you don't rush up there, I'll start asking questions. Because sorry, you said something I didn't want you to get away with. If nobody else has ever thought of it, it's probably not a good idea.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Well, usually when you're coming up with a hypothesis or something you want to study, if you think of something that nobody else has ever thought of, it's unusual for that to be a good idea. Even people like Einstein and stuff like that, when they thought of something original, they discussed it with other people. And the ideas usually start off as they're not very good and they need work. And the way you work ideas into viable hypotheses is by discussing with other knowledgeable people. And what you'll find is although you had a great idea, there's a lot of other people that had a very similar idea. And if you bring all those similar ideas together, then that leads to an emerging single idea that is probably the best of the bunch. It just improved.
All right. There are students here. I see some in the room who clearly are too shy to come up to the microphone. But you talked about the mentors in your life. Right. Everybody's awfully busy these days.
Right.
How did you find mentors, and how do you find time to mentor others?
That's a really good question. There are some people that are really good at it and some people who are not. And there is a bit of a process of natural selection. Over the years, I've seen many programs that have been organized to try to organize mentorship, to try to turn everybody or make people into mentors. And I'm not impressed that that's worked very well. I think there's some people that are just really good at it, and you have to try to find those people and cultivate them. And I think students, just like research ideas, interacting with each other helps research ideas. Students interacting with faculty helps them to identify mentors. People connect in ways that go beyond knowledge. They have to do with ability to communicate and things like that. So if you have a role model that you see as a student, you need to try to get over the nervy part and talk to that person and try to find people that will help you and discuss with you and be there for you.
We have a question walking up the aisle here. Yes, ma'am.
Well, it's not the question that's walking up the aisle. It's Marika Knipscher that's walking up the
I
aisle.
can't see it. I just barely can see you. Sure.
Okay. You mentioned something in your talk about when people have these funny little flutters, I call them, in the heart.
Yeah.
And then it's between sometimes 5 and 10 minutes before we kick the bucket. Well, my grandmother passed away when she was 34 from heart attack, and my mother when she was 59. So I'm figuring if I'm standing here and I have a fluttering of the heart, it's a fine place to have it because you're within a, 10-second jump of getting here.
Well, there's some young people in the audience who can get you quicker than I could.
Okay. But the question then is most of us are, in an office tower doing mundane tasks, as you say, administrative, and the rest of us are retired.
Didn't
maybe.
mean it to be that pejorative.
Exactly. And the rest of us are maybe at home or on holiday, or anyways, we're not that close to somebody who's got a fibrillator. So, if we start having these fibrillations or fluctuating of the heart, which I had in the middle of the night, and my arm starts getting a little tingly, what do we do? I mean, it's too late by then. I just rolled over and said, forget it, it's too late. And that was a year and a half ago, and I'm still standing here. So,
Well,
what do we do?
That tells you something right there, the fact that you've had these for a while and you're still standing here. So the sensation of your heartbeat flipping and flopping and doing funny things is the symptom of palpitation. And there are many different heart rhythms that cause palpitation. And palpitation in of itself is not necessarily a harbinger of something terrible happening. It's usually due to these premature beats, which can originate in the ventricles in the instance I was talking about, or in the atrium. And premature beats by themselves are harmless. They're only in certain settings that they have risk to them. And in the setting I was talking about was that the risk is in those people who have had a recent myocardial infarction. In most people that are walking around and otherwise healthy, and everybody has, as you get older, premature beats in general increase in frequency. The good news is that as you get older, you don't feel them as much.
Oh, good, thank you.
But always look on the bright side of life. So I think, if a person is concerned about this, you should consult your doctor, and then your doctor can do an assessment to determine whether these things mean anything or not. And 9 times out of 10, they don't mean anything. And the advice is just to ignore them.
That's what I thought. That's why I did that.
Right.
Ignore it, yeah.
No. Well,
Thank you.
it's a very wise decision because often the treatment for these, there are drugs that will suppress these, but often the risk of adverse effects from the drugs is greater than any risk you're going to have from treating the ventricular premature beats.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. What's your Alberta healthcare number?
This is not a billable hour. Question in the corner.
Hi, Dr. Wyse. So what kind of actions would you suggest current undergraduate students take to build research experiences?
Well, I think an undergraduate should try, I think where you'll get a lot of experience is as a summer student. So if you can find a position as a summer student, it depends on kind of where you are, but I think it's probably, I don't know, I'm guessing, it depends on the person, I guess, but probably between your second and third year, between your third and fourth years where you want to try to get some research experience. And so often there are positions available that are funded, and sometimes there's no funding, but there are mentors and people that have research labs that are willing to take on students in a volunteer basis. So what you want to do is try to improve your resume or your curriculum vitae in terms of showing research experience. And if you have an aptitude for it, then during the studentship, that can lead to something more promising.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Sir.
Tim Pollock, I guess I have to flip this up.
Tim, don't ask me a question about amiodarone.
I like the line about human versus machine is a mismatch. Because I see a dynamic controversy going on there between the human tendency to define the norm and now our increasing ability to find the specific, so the precision part of the medicine, but we also have the increasing ability to define the norm in those computers. More forms, more guidelines, more practice advice. And so what I see is when I find a patient where I'm able to tweeze them out of the population and precisely change their medication, there's 6 layers of resistance from people who say that's not the way you treat those patients. And
Yeah.
I think we're going to have a problem where
Yes, we are.
we're told by the computer that this is the right dose for that patient with that problem, and yet you have done either the pharmacogenetics or some other testing that shows, like therapeutic drug monitoring, that patient needs a radically different dose. And just to remind you about amiodarone, I have patients who have the same concentration getting 100 milligrams a week, as some that are taking 800 milligrams a week. And if you tried to give everybody the same dose, you would be in trouble. And yet there will be a form someplace telling me that the right dose is. Yeah.
It's often the pharmacy. Yeah, well, keep fighting the good fight. So I emphasize mismatch in terms of empathy, but the other thing is there is a place for experience and knowledge. Yeah. And I think that computers should become less of a barrier and more of an aid in these things. Because as you know, a lot of practitioners don't understand, a difficult drug like amiodarone don't understand the pharmacokinetics. And this is a really difficult problem. But there are other things as well. So I recently was talking to a friend who had gone to see a doctor. And one of the things she told me was, during the whole time I was there, he never looked at me. He only looked at his computer. And I thought, you know, that kind of illustrates the problem. We want to try to get away from that kind of thing. We're going to use computers, but I think when the patient's present, then we have to interact with the patient. I don't know, it's going to take time to overcome some of these things, but I think the kind of pharmacokinetic precision you're talking about is there. It can be done, and people can learn how to do it with the help of computers.
All right, we're going to do one last question. The person right behind you. Sure.
I have to pull this down.
That's fine.
So you gave a lot of great advice tonight, and I'm sure there's lots more where that came from. But you also talked about change, and I'm wondering whether there's any advice that you were given as a student or trainee, or that you hear being given to current students and trainees, that you would actually say to not follow, or that you wish you hadn't followed.
Well, I wish I didn't follow the high school counselor that told me only the smart people could do it. Probably, I was trying to think more along the positive, what are the positive things to think about, and I told you about several of those. I have a collection of cartoons and sayings that I use, probably about 150 of them, that I think illustrate good advice that I've had over time. And they're little snippets of things. These are the ones that I've picked out. I didn't tell you, one of the ones, for example, I meant to tell you when I was talking about my research is, a wise mentor once told me that when you're trying to explain your research to a lay audience, imagine you're talking to your mother-in-law. And I kind of did that when I was preparing that part of the lecture. And there are other things, so, things like the plural of anecdote isn't data. So I have hundreds of those. I just can't remember them anymore. Sorry.
Thank you.
All right. For a guy who was told he wasn't smart enough for medical school, that was a heck of a speech. Nice work tonight.
Thank you.
All right. Can't go yet, George. I'd like to invite up President Cannon and Chancellor Thirst are coming up to the stage now. They have a token of appreciation on behalf of the University of Calgary. They're just on their way.
Thank you.
George, we'd also like to say thank you for a superb lecture tonight, and the university has a small token of appreciation for you.
Thank you. Wow. I have a place for that.
So the painting that Dr. Cannon and I have just unveiled for Dr. Wyse is called Fading Light. It's by an artist named Judith Hall. We were told, George, that one of your favorite places to be is the Canmore and the Banff area. So
Yes.
we're hoping that you'll enjoy this scene here. If you'd like to view other works by Judith Hall, you can go to the Art Connection Gallery in
I
town.
will, thank you. I hope that fading light wasn't a personal remark.
Well, with comments like that, it goes without saying, George, that it was an honor to hear your lecture this evening.
Thank you very much.
You know, the wisdom and the contribution that you've made to the University of Calgary, our students, our community, our Calgary community has just been absolutely remarkable. And it's been a real privilege to hear some of your stories today.
Thank you very much.
The Lecture of a Lifetime series is an initiative of the Senate committee called Lecture of a Lifetime, and it's chaired by Tim Creelman. And they've done a really good job championing the series. This is our 10th year. George is just one of 10 people that have graced our lecture. The other members of the committee, it's important to mention to them because they've worked so hard behind the scenes over the last year to prepare for tonight's lecture. Arif Amlani, Lauren Bell, Young Fang, Mark Herman, Julie Lee, Barb McCutcheon, Jim McNeil, Kevin McNichol, Susan Nayland Sorrell, Greg Schmidt, Gordon Sick, and Shelley Wynn. Thank you very much to all of you for working so hard over the year to arrange for this evening's lecture. And an event like this doesn't happen without the behind-the-work scenes work of our office staff. So my staff from the Office of the Chancellor and Senate, our staff volunteers, our Chancellor's Scholars volunteers, thank you for helping this evening. And a special thank you to David Gray, our MC for this evening. David, you did another superb job. Thank you to CBC and your local colleagues, David, for giving us some publicity for the lecture. It's been just phenomenal, the number of people that we have turning out tonight, partly because of George's reputation, but also because of the partnership with CBC. So thank you very much. We hear that you're retiring, so not fading. But we wish you all the best in the next phase of your life, George. Live long and prosper.
Thank you.
Do you have time to have a picture taken with George?
We're going to have a picture taken on stage. George, come on over.
Yeah.
Photo right over in the side. And while they get their photo taken, I get to say thanks for coming tonight. Look, you've got even a member of your family down here, George. Look at that camera first. Look at that woman. That's the one right there. Good. Thanks, everybody, for coming. There's going to be coffee and tea at the back. So please stay, mingle, chat a little while, and don't forget to listen to your radio in the morning. Good night, everyone. Great.